It was in 1866 that Homer assisted in organizing the American Watercolor Society, though at that period he had not painted any watercolors, 30 years old at the time. However, later in the history of the Society's annual exhibitions, as will be shown, he won some of his most legitimate laurels and accolades in this field. Interestingly, the opening exhibition of the Innovative Society in New York was the first general exhibition of watercolors ever held in America, and the following year, 1867, Homer made his first voyage to Europe. Our interest in this presentation will focus on the remarkable work of Homer as a watercolorist. Homer spent 10 months in France. At the end of that time his money gave out, and he was obliged to return home. He did no studying and no serious work of any kind worth mentioning while in Paris, and it is probable that he devoted most of his time to sightseeing and taking in the sights and sounds, perhaps even making plans for future works as a result of his time there. But watercolors would play a part, as he was now devoted to the new society and its success. Soon after his return to New York, he contributed to Harper's Weekly, where he was a frequent contributor with a double-page drawing, and 3 weeks later a drawing called Art Students and Copyists in the Louvre Gallery, Paris, that served to show conclusively where the artist had spent a good part of his time while in the French capital. The long gallery of the Louvre was shown in perspective, with many copyists at work, both men and women. Homer was an ever-ready draftsman, and his line drawings along with the watercolor paintings became ever more frequent in his constant search for subject matter, and no doubt it must have been truly eye-opening for Homer to visit the Louvre and see the many industrious artists at work diligently copying, and at elbow's length. The year 1870 was not only exceptionally prolific, but it also marked an appreciable advance in respect to Homer's art. For during this period his drawing begins to improve noticeably. No less than 11 of his paintings were exhibited at the National Academy of Design. Of these paintings, that which is perhaps as characteristic as any is the sailboat. He repeated this motive in the form of a watercolor many times. Artists have continually found the greatest source of inspiration, as Sir Joshua Reynolds observed, that he who recurs to nature at every recurrence renews his strength. The rules of art he is never likely to forget. They are few and simple. Nature is refined, subtle, and infinitely various, beyond the power and retention of memory. It is necessary, therefore, to have continual recourse to her. Homer did a series of drawings, including Making Hay, which was published in Harper's Weekly on July 6, 1872, and made during one of his frequent visits to Belmont. And shown here is the Homer House, named for its original owner, William Flagg Homer, a wealthy Boston merchant, who built the property in 1853 as a summer residence. William Flagg was the uncle of Winslow Homer, whose artwork of Belmont people and places included his uncle's home. The editor of the Weekly enthusiastically remarked, "Mr. Winslow Homer's beautiful picture is a poem in itself, a summer idyll, suggestive of all that is most pleasant and attractive in rural life." One can hardly agree with this judgment. Making hay is pleasant and attractive to the spectator, perhaps, but it is hard and hot work for the haymaker. "You will see in the future I will live by my watercolors," Homer once remarked, and he was mostly right. He came to the medium late, but he proved a ready hand at the delicate washes and nuances of colour overlapping, and the generously rich darks at times creating a mood that keeps one's attention engrossed for long periods. His view of the America he chose was of the working, happy, generous, playful folks who made the country strong and were not ashamed of toil. The rewards were well worth it. Homer was not restrained by subject, shirking nothing, evading no difficulties, using his own faculties of perception, solving his own problems, ever learning, even from his own small defeats. In a literal sense, he was his own master and his own severest critic. Nothing daunted him. Critic Mr. Coffin has written, "Sometimes it is asked, what might not Winslow Homer have done if he had had a thorough art education at the beginning of his career? I fancy that those who ask this question do not know what a great school nature is, when the pupil is a persistent searcher for truth, and has the strength of purpose that has enabled Mr. Homer to find adequate forms of expression in his own way." Homer was very much attached to themes around and dealing with water. His ability to analyze and record the movements around heaping waves, moody sunsets by a beach, or the dramatic power of the sea, he is fully in command. Whether in oils or watercolor or pencil, his analytical observations are spot on. For the artist, well beyond any cover story, is the technical achievement that must underscore all great works of art. Merely rendering is not the same as heightened draftsmanship, as anyone who has picked up a pencil to draw realizes. Art rests on the basics well learned and honed over time, as pieces of a puzzle are slowly made into a whole. Homer's skill to distribute the spots of lights and darks gives life to a work, gliding from one area of the picture to the other, a rhythm of elements mended together, observed in nature, bonds the artist with a sure composition that is well choreographed, well drawn, and satisfying. As we move from pictures of the sea, and how Homer was unafraid to tackle the unusual and the unfamiliar aspects, one must always be alert to find and record any moment in time. So we turn to look to Homer's more domestic side of everyday life and, yes, work. Men are doing their trade, boys in trees on a limb, girls playing with friends, or the school teacher is beside the blackboard readying for class. Homer is ready to seize the moment. Being always curious and ready is the key factor. Today the snapshot by a camera may be employed for that instantaneous incidence, but for the painter it means design, memory, and what to say about the circumstances at play. And why is it meaningful to the painter? Technically, that is the joy of creation, to say something. Painters look to utilize their trade for any happenstance they happen upon, or in the case of still life a time to carefully study each individual item, to give it all its glory in paint. Homer was a total workman, and it is recorded he was constantly working, rarely at leisure, and always on the lookout for subjects. Artists can sometimes run into hazards when looking for a place to paint, venturing off into unknown regions, and Homer was no exception. His journey once led him to Texas, and stopping at a small hotel, he rested for a bit on the porch. Let's pick up the story from here. His biographer relates, "One day he was sitting on the porch of the hotel where he was staying when a bad man rode up to the gate, dismounted, tied his horse, and started to come up the walk, with a most threatening aspect. Homer, relating the incident, said, 'I looked him in the eyes, as mother used to tell me to look at a wild cow.' The artist was sitting with his hands in his pockets. When halfway to the porch, the bad man hesitated, halted, and, turning on his heel, strode back to his horse, mounted, and rode away. He had no sooner disappeared than a gentleman from Texas, who had been sitting on the porch near Homer, crawled out from under an adjacent bench. 'What did you get down there for?' asked Homer. 'Well,' said the Texan, 'it was not my fight, and I thought there was going to be some shooting.' 'Why did he go away?' asked Homer. 'Well, I'll tell you. He thought you had a derringer in each hand, and were going to get the drop on him.' He went on to explain that sometimes men shot from their pockets. Homer was not harmed. He went on, finished what work he had begun, and returned north. Although light-hearted to some extent, it does show the trials that may accompany the painter in real-life situations. When Homer visited France in '76, at the very height of its glory for artists, it would be at war in 1870, resulting in the loss of important artists like Henri Regnault and the wounding of Bastien Lepage, not to mention Bouguereau, who stood his ground when the Prussians entered his studio. Homer was also a Civil War recorder with sketches and artwork of the conflict. However, the painter returns eventually to the security of a studio and workshop to dream of new works ahead. Mr. Homer can see and lay hold of the essentials, and he paints his own thoughts, not other people's, said the Art Journal of London in 1878. It is not strange, therefore, that almost from the outset of his career as a painter, his works have compelled the attention of the public. They reveal on the part of the artist an ability to grasp dominant characteristics and to reproduce specific expressions of scenes and sitters, and for this reason no two of Homer's pictures look alike. His cotton picker's studies, brought from Virginia, are in several respects total freedom from conventionalism and mannerism, in their strong look of life and their sensitive feeling for character, the most successful things of the kind that America has yet produced. Coincident with the beginning of Homer's series of sea pieces and his abandonment of work for the illustrated press was a marked development of his faculty for making a striking and original pictorial design or pattern. From 1880 onward we find this faculty constantly working out remarkable results in all his pictures. It was not, however, such a sudden accomplishment as it might seem to the casual observer, for if we look back through the pages of Harper's Weekly in the early 70s, we cannot fail to note here and there those fortuitous delights in the disposition of the light and dark masses which contribute so tellingly to the impressiveness of a picture. This is what a discerning critic has called the mysterious power of unerring choice. The construction, the very shape of these works of nature remains in the mind as he presents them, writes Mr. Fowler, on the spots, the masses. The relation they bear to one another, stay in the memory, fades not from one's remembrance. It is not through technical means alone that such a result is achieved. It must be something more. Treating the subjects as Homer does, one does not care for too superficial and facile handling. On consideration, you feel that his touch is the natural and consequential outcome of the theme. It is largely the design which gives them their potency in our memory. They have their stamp, and this is indeed their distinction. Nature, broad, spacious, and truth, seems to have sunk into his mind, fixed there in shape or pattern, strong spots of sky or water, almost savage at times in their colouring. No straining for originality. His vision is as clear as a window pane through which one might look out upon the scene, fresh as the air we breathe. He painted the things he saw and added no commentary. His work continued to be, in a certain sense, historical rather than critical. Homer was, all his life, a historian and a reporter, but in an uncommonly impartial and detached manner. His natural and unstudied adherence to literal truth, seemingly not a singular merit in an artist, was, after all, the great thing that stayed with him throughout his career. How rare it is will be discovered by any observer who candidly sets out to seek for it in the work of painters. His power of seeing things in their integrity and of rendering that aspect of them in pictures is the least common of attainments. This is what makes his pictures radiate, so different from those of other painters, as some have observed, which gives them the weight of authority, the power of grasping the mind, and remaining in the memory. Artists are always interested in the set-up of studios of their fellows. Here we have Homer's studio, which was made up of a chalet-style building. Homer usually stayed at Prout's Neck until the first heavy snowstorm in December. Then he locked up his cottage for the rest of the winter and started for the south, Florida, Nassau, or Bermuda. But he generally returned to Prout's Neck as early as March. There were some years that he remained at the shore all winter, though he made occasional trips to Boston and New York. He employed a man to come to the house in the morning and attend to the household chores. The rest of the time he was alone, except when he needed to employ a model. The cottage is of wood, painted a pale green. It has no architectural pretensions. In the studio, a litter of artists' materials, properties, costumes, canvases, and the like, a birch-bark canoe from Canada, and an astonishing amount of fishing tackle and sporting trappings were usually to be seen. His brother Charles says he did not go in for expensive or elaborate tackle, but he usually caught the biggest fish. One might make a folk tale of this and apply it to his art. The most absurd tales are told about Winslow Homer's hermit-like manner of living. Naturally, as one of his purposes in settling there was to obtain freedom from interruption during his sustained efforts, he would not open his doors to casual callers who knocked for admission, some of whom were inspired by nothing more serious than idle curiosity to meet a noted painter and see his work in the studio. It may well be that he sometimes, through negligence, turned away from his door a visitor whom he would have been glad to welcome if he had only known what his object was. It is certain that those who did partake of his hospitality had no cause to complain of any coldness. In the library which Winslow Homer collected, there was a copy of Chevreul's book on colour, which his elder brother had given him many years ago, and this copy was almost read to pieces, so worn was it with use. He was accustomed to do a great deal of looking before he decided upon a subject to paint, and sometimes he would spend whole days just looking at the sea without touching a brush, although he was one of the first painters in America to take the trouble to carry a canvas several miles for the purpose of making a study from nature which interested him, yet he did not always work directly from nature. His extraordinary memory for visual impressions served him well, that at times he could record the scene he wished to paint without any preparation except the slightest of notes and the hastiest sketch. He was an early riser, and frequently he would get up at 4:30 in the summer and go off for long walks before anybody else was up, so as to be sure of being alone. He knew and loved every part of the cliffs and rocks. For 10 or 11 years Winslow's constant companion was his dog Sam, an Irish terrier, whose death was such a source of grief to his master that he would never get another dog. Winslow Homer was very fond of his 2 nephews, and when they were small boys he made 2 amusing drawings of them, setting forth in slightly sarcastic fashion their respective characteristics. Between the periods of strenuous work on his oil paintings, it was Homer's custom to do some manual labour, a sensible and useful change of occupation, which rested him and for the time being relieved the strain on his nerves. He not only performed the garden work, he built a stone wall and constructed a dog-house for Sam. Once, when he had made picture dealers wait a long time for a reply to a business letter, he finally wrote, apologizing for his tardiness by stating that he had been very busy building a dog-house. Homer lived well at Prout's Neck. We hope you enjoyed seeing the work of Winslow Homer and the industrious spirit he had, an inspiration to artists anywhere who plough their trade with great joy. So, we leave you till next time, and remember to leave a like, and be sure to subscribe. So till next time, it's bye for now.